cottage, and the lot that it's on is known as Point Cedilla. And Cedilla was my great-grandmother's middle name. And so it was named after her, basically. And this place was built in 1910, so it's over 100 years old.
And my grandfather bought this property in 1903, and he sold the piece next door to his best friend, and the other piece to another friend, and built the cottage. It wasn't easy.
My grandmother had come up here as a girl to a girls' camp. And when she was dating my grandfather, he was looking for a place to build a summer cottage on a Canadian lake. He was originally a Canadian from Elmira. And she had come up here as a young girl and suggested this is one option.
Our family has been on Lake Abbes for 7 generations, and my family were the ones that opened Ronville Lodge way back. Oh. And then they moved from Ronville, well, next generation moved over the other side of the lake and so on, and then eventually my grandmother came to teach down at Paint Lake, just like any other lady teacher, yeah. You get a lady teacher in the community, you don't let her go. So my grandfather married her.
He used to fish up here with some buddies, and he liked the area, and so that's why he bought it.
And this was your grandpa?
My grandfather, okay. My mother's side.
Okay.
We just fell in love with it, and even the agent, she had a file folder of the other spots that we were to go to later in the day. And she tore it in half. I said, "What are you doing?" And she said, "There's no point in showing you anything else." And that was it.
The government in England were giving these lots away, 100-acre lots. And that's what these people were coming to. They didn't know when they went to put the shovel in the ground, 6 inches under the top was stone. They formed the English Land Company. And they were given the responsibility to develop this whole area and into 100-acre lots.
So we've been coming up just about every year, since I was born, and family before that. Both of my grandparents, so great-grandfather and grandfather, were doctors. And they used to actually tend to people here on the lake back in the early days when there was no other option.
1903. It's a long time ago. And he couldn't swim a stroke, and he cleaned out this passageway so that our kids could get to his best friend's kids without drowning.
Zachariah Cole came and settled right here. He was the second white man to settle here. His family were the first family to be raised here and born and raised here. But he was by far the most successful farmer in the whole area. By the time he died, he had over 1,000 acres of property, and was making quite a good living off it. And plus, he was also the first treasurer for Rideout Township. He was the first road superintendent for Rideout Township, and he did that in his spare time.
My great-grandfather's name was Daniel B. Stumpf, and he was a fisherman. He liked to fish. His job occupation was a holistic doctor. Around 1907, 1908, he discovered the Lake of Bays and pretty much fell in love with the area. And the story goes that he stood in the town of Dorset and walked along the shore. So he found this little point of land and decided to buy it. And to the best of my recollection, he paid about $500.
And he gave us boundaries as the brook is one side.
The brook, right. The lake, and then there's a line that goes up to the road, and then the road, which was known as the survey says you measure from Bob Cajun Road, which I think is Highway 35.
First of all, the road is the dividing line here. One side is Haliburton County, the other is the District of Muskoka. And in this side of the road, in the Haliburton side, 97% of the township was Crown land. So what they did, they opened up the lakes for, you could go and buy a lot on any lake. Started 25 cents a foot to start at. You went and picked out the lot you wanted, and they would survey it for you, do a rough survey, and then you got an official survey, and you bought the lot. and built, and you had to build your cottage within 2 years.
Later, my grandmother and grandfather got married, and into their early marriage years, they bought this property. And she actually designed the cottage and picked the lot and had the construction done, kind of at the against my grandfather's better wishes, you might say. But she was determined it was going to happen. And then wound up dying 4 years later. So she didn't get a chance to enjoy it very much. But the cottage has been in our name now since 1927.
When we first came up here, the kitchen had a hand pump in it.
Yeah.
And would pump water from the brook. And then of course we'd boil it, and then we'd set it in pitchers in the brook to cool it. And that was our drinking water or cooking water. And then I remember washing clothes. We had this, cylinder-shaped washing machine that just did this. And there was a thing on it that had a little roller, and you'd roll your clothes through it. And then you'd take everything down to the lake, which I know we weren't supposed to do, but we didn't know that in those days. And we'd rinse stuff out in the lakes going like this, we'd stand on the shore, and then we'd have a wash basin and another one of those rollers, and you'd roll them through the roller, and then you'd have to hang them up. It was like a day's job to do that.
My great-grandfather, who owns that cottage, had 2 boys and 2 girls. He gave the 2 boys a college education. He gave the 2 girls that cottage. And somehow they divvied it up, and one of them wound up with it, which was Paul's grandmother at the time.
First World War came along. All of a sudden, all the lumbering quit. So now we don't have any income. So people started to leave in droves. They were just abandoning the lot. And we ended up with a lot of property because they would owe us a bill. Everybody had bills at the store. And they would owe us a bill, and they would come and say, look, we're leaving. Write off the bill, give us a few dollars, and we'll sign over the property. Because if they didn't, the property just went back to the township for taxes anyway. So, and everything was going great until the Depression came along. And then all of a sudden we can't even pay the taxes. So then we had to start dumping property. We sold a whole island, Eagle Island on Corrigan Lake for $2,000. We nearly went broke. And that's when my father went in the Army, and then we closed the store for 3 years and then reopened just as the war was coming to an end.
As far as we know, Wadsworth, an American, built it started in around 1927.
There was no way he was going to be staying up here if he didn't have electricity, and therefore they needed so many accounts to be paid for to be able to bring it up here. So they needed 10 accounts, and so he said, I'll pay for 5 accounts if we can get a couple other people in town to pay for that. So he helped to instigate bringing electricity from Bracebridge. So then Dorset had electricity, I believe it was in 1931.
Prior to that, I believe it was empty and vacant for about 18, 19 years. So there was every nest known to man here, and it was pretty dilapidated. He ended up selling it to the Selby family. We have letterhead at Cedilla Fresh Air Camp, and we have registries of kids' names and whether they were efficient swimmers or poor or non-swimmers, what religion they were, and they ran it as a camp for a couple of years, we understand.
He would bring up underprivileged children every summer for a 1-2 week stint. And he actually had a 6-room dormitory. It looked like a very small motel.
We know there were many buildings because we've got a little cupboard with keys with everything marked on what shed or what building it was for.
And there was a guest cottage and garages. I think he had 2 garages and a workshop, and a total of 1,200 feet of shorefront originally.
They had a little tennis court, which you can still see the foundation for, and some of the mesh for the screening around. They made a chute that started halfway up the hill, and it was like a toboggan run to go down to the lake for kids to slide down on.
Fred McKee died, and my mom married my father, Harry Robinson, and they operated the store. The war came along. My father went away to war, came back, and got the store going really well. And that's when things started to really perk. Because previous to that, our customers were really loggers, and that was the biggest industry here then at the time. And then after the war, then it turned really over to tourism. We would never borrow money, so what we did, when we got a little bit of money, we put another addition on. That's why the store is built in 14 different editions. 14 different editions, yeah.
To travel up here at that time, it took them like 3 days. Coming from Buffalo, New York.
My dad was a young teenager. It was about the time we built this property. He described driving from off of Highway 11, or I'm not sure what it was called at that time, but he said it was basically two tracks across the rocks.
When I was young, the Iroquois used to come in here, the Iroquois boat. Big one come in maybe once or twice a year, they'd bring them up, but basically it was the Iroquois. It was a lot bigger boat than the big one.
My great-grandparents came by steamship. They'd take a train from Buffalo to Toronto, and another train up to Gravenhurst, and another train up to Huntsville. Get on the steamship, go through the portage, and into Dorset. And then go, I guess, walk to the cottage from there.
And my mother remembers often coming to Huntsville and going to the North Portage and taking the train to the South Portage, and then taking one of the steamboats in too. She remembers doing that.
And she remembers the Iroquois quite well.
We came by train a couple of times, and then there's a road, and my grandfather drove about 2 miles an hour.
And this was actually the original road to Algonquin Park through here.
And the last part of the trip, they had to get out of the car because it wouldn't make it up the road.
Sometimes they'd have to push it, or with the weight and all
with
that.
the weight and everything, so they would get out of the car.
Because this Highway 117, which used to be 118, was like a roller coaster, just up and down and over, and it'd take over an hour to get from Bracebridge to here.
Across the bridge, the stores over there, they were closed. Now they're back up and running. They're filled with different businesses, which are great, and the restaurants. And, like, as I say, and we all work together. Just like years ago, when Claytons were across the bridge, and we were here, we were supposedly in competition to each other. We both had a bill at each other's store, and once a year we would bounce it up.
I always thought, like in my dream, that I would be a potter living at the cottage, and all of a sudden I was, and that was, it's like come true.
We have the boat to attract people. We have the tower, brings a lot of people, and our store.
I wrote a little poem because they were hesitant on selling it. And I said, it'll remain in good hands forever. And she received my poem via fax that I had faxed over to her. She picked up the phone, she said, it's yours.
It's been a super experience for me in my life, because I've become friends with so many people, and they look forward to coming, and we look forward to them coming. It's a lot like a family as opposed to as to customers.
It's absolutely great to be able to get away from the humdrum of things and sit here on the porch and look out over the lake. You know, as we always said, it never changes, but it's always different.
The one thing I noticed that it hasn't changed. It's just there, and it really hasn't changed.
Kind of this constant throughout the generations. This place is a constant. You may move. We lived in Massachusetts, we lived in New Jersey, in 2 different places. We spent a year in Germany, but this was always a place that, you know,
Everybody.
you had a base.
Yeah.
2 years ago, I came home in February. Beautiful morning. I got up, and there was nobody around, and I was sitting looking out on the lake, and the sun shining, sparkling on the snow. I actually started to cry. I thought, how lucky I've been to be able to do that.